Good evening, everyone, and welcome tonight to the Clore studio here at the Royal Opera House in London. My name is Abdul, Malik, and I'm the programs manager at the Radical Middle Way, also moonlight as a journalist for BBC Radio, and it's my pleasure tonight to be hosting this panel as part of the One World, Many Faiths program that the Welsh National Opera and the Maimonides Interfaith Foundation are putting on together in celebration of the revival of Schoenberg's opera Moses and Aron. Tonight we have a really exciting panel of guests to talk about the issue of British identity and cultural difference. But I think we should probably begin by sort of setting the scene. And I think the scene for tonight is really the revival of this opera. Moses and Aron by Schoenberg is a remarkable opera by every stretch of the imagination, exploring the biblical story of Moses and Aron at a time where anti-Semitism was on the rise in Germany. Schoenberg himself was born into a Jewish family, converted to Lutheran Christianity, and then returned to his Jewish roots, and eventually left Germany and went to the United States to flee the rising anti-Semitism in his homeland. The opera itself came at a time where the whole notion of Jewish identity and broadly German identity was in a state of flux, and people often note, or scholars often note, that the opera itself remained unfinished, with Moses kind of leaving Aron to guide his people through to the promised land. And I think that says something about what the opera meant for Schoenberg, and in many ways means for us today. We're living at a time where national identity again and cultural difference again is at the forefront of our headlines, whether they're tabloid or broadsheet. The recent European elections have raised the questions again about European identity, and the rise of the far right, particularly in continental Europe, is cause for great concern. Tonight we're hoping that with our panel we're going to be tackling some of these issues around political context, around the nature of art and culture and the way that it mediates identity, and drawing on their own personal experiences to talk about Britishness today at this point in the 21st century. We're joined by three guests, and in no particular order. we have Dave Rich. Dave Rich is the Deputy Director of Communications with the Community Security Trust, a Jewish charity. Julie Siddiqi, next to him, is the former Executive Director of the Islamic Society of Britain, still part of the Islamic Society of Britain, and part of a really exciting initiative coming up this Ramadan called the Big Iftar, which I hope we'll have a chance to hear about. And finally, Daniel Trilling is the editor of the very excellent new Humanist magazine, which I've had the opportunity to know for many years, so it's good to have you with us. Daniel, I want to begin tonight's conversation with you, Dave. And I was fascinated that sort of reading about Moses and Aron, and really, reading about Schoenberg's own life story, this idea that through the opera, in many ways, he comes back to his Jewish roots and explores those roots again, having left Judaism. And earlier on, you were speaking about the fact that this is something that was really common in Germany at the time. I'd love for you to shed some light on this.
Well, it was common in 19th century Germany. Huge percentages of Jews converted to Christianity because this was the entry ticket into German society, into European society. Emancipation of the Jews began in the 1770s, really, in Germany. And you had this very long process of German Jews trying to integrate and assimilate in all different parts of German society. They were never large in number. The percentage of German population that was Jewish was never more than 1%. But it became a big issue in Germany. By late 19th century, when you had the rise of German nationalism and the Völkisch nationalism, attitudes to Jews became totemic, really, for much bigger political and social debates around emancipation and liberalism versus authoritarian nationalism. And this, in a way, was the tragedy of German Jewry, is that they were the most assimilated Jewish community in Europe at the time when Schoenberg wrote the opera, and of course he was one of many German Jews who realized that no matter how hard Jews tried, they were not going to be accepted, and tragically a great many Jews didn't see what was coming in Germany. And I think in that respect, it's very interesting to see the opera being revived now because we live in such a different environment now. There are, of course, pressures to integrate and pressures to adapt on all minorities, and this is something I'm sure we'll come on to discuss, but it's a very different environment, I think, for all minorities nowadays.
But yet we see in Europe the rise of anti-Semitism, the attacks recently in Brussels a few years ago in Toulouse. I know organizations like yours have been tracking that. Organizations within Muslim communities have been seeing similarly rise of anti-Muslim violence and what we now term Islamophobia. It's an interesting time for us to be revisiting an opera, a great sort of piece of culture that came up at a time when attacks on Jews and anti-Semitism was approaching what would become its height in Germany. How do you feel about the lay of the land today in terms of discrimination?
Well, it's very different from then because Europe is a very different place. Well, certainly the societies of Western Europe, demographically, politically, very different. The whole foundation of the EU, the whole political philosophy of the EU is a response to that period in many ways. And now we have this one of the many crises thrown up by the recent election results is the entry of far-right parties into the European Parliament, and to what extent does this undermine the political point, if not the economic point of
There's
the
something
of the
disturbing
EU.
about these nefarious elements now being legitimized by a political process. And we've seen this happen in Europe before, where the most nefarious elements are legitimized by a political process. To me, that's frightening.
Well, it is, because the problem for all minorities comes when intolerant parties or intolerant forces are in power. As long as you have a government and a police force that, at least on paper, is committed to combating discrimination and to varying extents will follow that up with action, then you've got something to work with. As soon as you have political forces in power, whether that's in the local town hall or in national government, that are themselves xenophobic, that themselves want to roll back diversity, then you've got problems. Of course, the situation in terms of the lie of the land, the situation for Jewish communities in Europe has an extra element that in some countries is the dominant element, which is anti-Semitism from other directions. And we saw what happened in Brussels at the Jewish Museum. This is a very different issue from the strength of the far right in the Belgian or the French, as it turns out, elections. But for those Jewish communities on the ground, this is where the most acute threat comes from now.
Before I move on to Julie, how does it feel today to be Jewish in Britain?
It depends. It depends on where you live. It depends on how Jewish you look. It depends on how much Israel is a central part of your Jewish identity and how much you get involved in public and political debates about Israel. So there are large parts of the country where largely secular Jews go about their lives and don't experience any anti-Semitism. There are parts of the country where visibly Orthodox Jews experience anti-Semitism every single day of their lives. And there are parts of the country where Jewish people who live side by side in the same roads will have those opposing experiences simply because of how they look and how they feel about themselves as Jewish. So it's a very Jewish answer.
Yes, it is. It most certainly is. Julie, you're no stranger to complexity, and I'm sure the complexity that Dave has just described is the complexity that you've lived. Being someone, for lack of a better word, English, and being someone who came to the Islamic faith, has been an activist for, I guess, most of your adult life. I was initially going to say you're bicultural, but you're not. You're actually multicultural, and have been involved in all kinds of really amazing and exciting work that's brought people of different cultures and faiths together. So I should start with the question I ended with Dave on. How does it feel to be Muslim in Britain today?
I think as an optimist, I'm normally generally positive, but I genuinely feel that I'm lucky to be a Muslim and woman living in Britain. I think it does have its complexities. I think we are going through challenging times, but I sort of feel that it's partly a phase and it will come out somewhere else in a different place. And I think with the challenges, of course, we have intra-Muslim challenges that are sometimes, for me, more challenging than maybe fitting in with in a wider picture. So it's never a dull day, as I would say. But I think, generally I feel it's positive, and I think when there are challenges, it really gives us opportunities, work together to look for our commonalities, And I think certainly Muslim communities need to be, I think, a bit more aware of the history of this country, the kind of things that, the Jewish community have been through and how they worked through those. And I think there's a lot we can learn from some of that. And I'm not sure how aware people are of all of that, really. But I kind of feel I have multiple identities that sort of overlap and weave in and out of each other. And this idea that, you have to be one or the other, British or Muslim, and which one are you? And, I don't kind of buy that.
Seems like a ridiculous question, doesn't it?
It does.
To most of us. It's Jewish and British or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, but people have chosen to use that to sort of almost try and define, and then within different communities that debate happens. But I absolutely don't see it as a conflict at all.
And just over a year ago, we saw the violent murder of Lee Rigby in Woolwich, and I think many people who might be watching, and many people here who joined us today in the audience, will remember the role that you played in the aftermath of that murder, as sort of the tensions in communities. In some communities, reached fever pitch, the hand wringing, the condemnation, but then also the ugly side of the response, and you were sort of front and center, and we saw you on Newsnight, we saw you in the media. How is it to be a Muslim then, sort of being thrust into that role, and how did you approach your role at that time? Because I know many within Muslim communities saw your presence as a breath of fresh air, and said, oh, thank God we have someone like Julie Siddiqi speaking from within a Muslim, from a Muslim voice.
Yeah, I mean, I think it happened, when none of us were expecting something like that to happen. And it was, in many ways, I wanted to just run away and kind of just try and deal with it in the way that we all were trying to. How do I explain this to my kids? They watched it unfold on the news with me, and how do we kind of explain what's just going on, and why is he talking about the Quran? And, it's really hard, just on a personal level within my own family. I'll always remember it, literally my kids watching it on the news and kind of thinking, oh my gosh. And then the next day was just a media kind of, from an hour later, and it's, it has to be partly natural, it has to be natural, but then you have to be able to think on your feet as well. So I kind of just went with it, really. And I think the thing that people appreciated, and it wasn't just me, there were many people that did whatever they could as well. It was that we, kept it real, really, and, didn't try to be something that we weren't, and just said whatever we felt from the heart, really. And I think that's what people appreciated, and that's what they haven't had, unfortunately, because, the spokespeople that we often see can sometimes be more problem than they're worth, really. And so I think that's what people found. And obviously being a woman as well, I think that helped people. That was different as well, I think. But it's very challenging, but I think since then, the opportunities that have arisen, some of the stories that have come out of that year are quite incredible, actually, of communities coming together. Maybe we can explore some of that.
Yeah, and I think those are things that are often left out of the public narrative. Daniel, you edit a magazine which some people have said, and I think I would agree with, offers the best coverage of religion in the United Kingdom today. And interestingly enough, the magazine is the New Humanist magazine. And I think the point has often been made that those who are humanists or atheists are often more concerned about religion than the religious folks are. So in a way, you have an interesting insight in terms of the religious landscape in Britain today, and I guess the crossover between religion and public life. How do you address this question in your own work, and as a journalist, the question of cultural and particularly religious difference in the United Kingdom today? What are some of the fault lines?
Well, I suppose there's two ways that I do it through my work, and one of them is with New Humanist. And I mean, there's a strand of atheist writing, I think, that seeks to disprove or debunk religion, and that actually interests me less. And I think one of the reasons why New Humanist is successful as a magazine in terms of, you know, the ideas it puts forwards, is that our approach is less about that, and it's more about taking a sort of spirit of rational inquiry to religion itself, so we can analyse bits of religious traditions slightly from an outsider's perspective, I think, and that to me is always quite a good way of approaching a subject, that, you know, you can maybe kind of see things from several different angles. You're not sort of bound, you're not feeling like you've also got to be kind of you know, proselytizing at the same time, and you can sort of have a bit more distance from a subject and get into it. So I think that's perhaps why New Humanist, you know, under its previous editor as well, did this sort of strand quite well. But for me, I've also got quite a strong interest as a journalist in writing about cultural differences, the way that racism manifests itself in Britain. I've written a lot about the, you know, the far right in Britain and Europe and elsewhere, and I found that the issues have come into that as much, just as much, you know, through that side of my work too.
And how do you see that side of your work today? This whole question of cultural difference and I mean broadly tolerance. I mean, there's been this sense, you know, I say we British because technically I am a British citizen, although things like accent and so on often belie that fact. But I'll speak in the royal we British. Pride ourselves on a kind of a broad sense of tolerance. Live and let live. We exist alongside each other. We might not necessarily like each other some of the time. We get along. But are we getting along less?
Well, I suppose when people start talking about British values, it sort of makes me think, well, you know, people like to then put forward some very obviously positive values about the way people want to get on with one another. So they talk about, oh, well, we get on, we live and let live, or we like free speech, we like people of different cultures coming together. And, you know, when I hear that conversation getting going, I start thinking, well, how much is that really a British value? Is that not just, you know, that is what people generally do? You know, how much more do people in, say, France live and let live than people in Britain or get on? And I think on an everyday level, that's pretty much a constant of different societies. I think where the differences are is in how official culture likes to project itself. So, you know, Britain has had this tradition of national identity here, having a bit more give and take. You know, the sort of tradition of multiculturalism in Britain has been, at certain points, welcomed and promoted by the state, whereas in other countries, France again is an example, they've had a much more rigid attitude to, you know, immigrant groups should assimilate. But I think what shows you that there's this disparity between official culture and sort of the sort of grassroots everyday life manifestation of it is that France is patently as full of cultural difference as Britain is. It's just the way in which people talk about it and try and deal with it can be very, very different.
So today, at this point in the 21st century, are we less tolerant, more tolerant than we were a generation ago?
I think, particularly in the last 50 years, with, you know, Britain has had this history of, first of all, waves of immigration from former colonies, and then, you know, that's been supplemented in more recent years with a much broader, much more diverse range of immigration. And I think there are certain things you can point to along the way where you can say, yes, these have been positive achievements. You know, either groups of people who've arrived here have organised and asserted themselves and said, we're here, we belong. You know, there's a very strong tradition of that happening in Britain, going back to how, you know, the Jewish community organised itself in the early 20th century, and then how you got Afro-Caribbean and Asian migrants doing similar things in the 60s and 70s. But at the same time, intolerance sort of changes to adapt to new circumstances. And I think one of the big shifts you've had, you know, this is something that really actually does go back until at least the 1960s, but it's become much more of an issue in the last decade or so, which is, you know, there's been a real shift in the whole discourse around race, shifting it away from this idea of race as a biological phenomenon to culture and cultural difference. And that, very often older prejudices have found a new way of being expressed. And I think the most obvious example of that since the turn of the century has been the way in which religion has been pushed to the fore, and particularly the sort of discourse surrounding Muslims. And there are various reasons why that has or hasn't happened. But I think, I don't know if others will disagree with me here, I don't think it's actually about religion. I think the culture aspect is the more important aspect of that.
Dave, do you want to take that up? It's an interesting assertion. As religion becomes a more important or a marker of identity, does it have to do with faith and religion itself, or is it something about cultural difference? And how does that play out within a Jewish context? Because there's an interesting fault line there between Judaism as a faith and a confession, and of course Jewishness as a cultural identity.
Well, Jews around the world, and I think especially in Britain, are largely secularized, and for a lot of Jews, their Jewishness expressed through religious practice is a culture. It's an ethnicity. It's not predicated on belief necessarily. And I think the interesting point about whether the current debates in Britain about religion are really about religion or not is whether the people leading these debates really care about their own religion. And, Britain is not an overt, it is very much a Christian country, but not through overt public practice and public consciousness. It is through its structures. So I think in that respect, yes, this is about culture and it's about cultural change. And I think one of the drivers of this, one of the turning points where religion became part of public debate was the Rushdie affair. And prior to that, all of these debates were in terms of race and to a certain extent culture, but it was in the language of race, race relations. And it was really the Rushdie affair when, for the first time, majority community, for want of a better phrase, noticed a minority community asserting its religiosity and its religious identity rather than a cultural identity. And then you have the language, the same debate starts taking place through the language of faith and religious identity. And I think somebody who was involved in the race relations debates of the 1960s and 70s, if they time traveled forward to now, they would be quite astonished at the extent to which exactly the same debates take place through religious language, and we now talk in terms of faith communities. The Jewish community under the 1976 Race Relations Act was accepted as an ethnicity for purposes of law, right? And now, when anti-Semitic hate crimes are recorded by the police as religious hatred or racial hatred, and there's this confusion because as the debate has changed, the Jewish community, which was established and recognized in previous times, has kind of been dragged along to this new world of faith communities.
Well, yeah, just a side note to that. I mean, I was quite taken aback by the last census form that only allowed you to put, the box saying Jewish was under the list of religions, which for someone like me, who half my family are from a Jewish background, I'd like there to be a way of acknowledging that in, the non-religious column, as it were. But
this is
that's fascinating.
This is the question, not just on the census, but on a lot of forms. I know a lot of Jewish people who will tick white other for the ethnicity because they consider their Jewishness to be an ethnicity. And as much as Jews are recognized as an ethnic group for the purposes of prosecutions, the law in this country has always struggled to categorize Jews because Jewishness crosses over so many of these boundaries.
Julie, I'm going to come to you on this, but I know we have a very select audience in the room, but I know many of the people who are here bring a lot of experience and some very interesting perspectives. So I am going to come to you actually in a few moments. I may even pick on some of you. So be ready to be picked on, because I'd love to hear what some of you have to say, and feel free to actually add things that we haven't set up here. So you've been warned. Julie, I mean, the Rushdie affair is often seen as a sort of like a symbolic marker of where a Muslim identity as a political, social identity tied to faith really comes to the fore. And I think today we're very much living in the aftermath of that. And the ground, as Daniel and Dave said, and I think we would agree, has certainly shifted a great deal. Do you find it that problematic as a Muslim activist yourself when Muslimness becomes the kind of the key marker of personal, political, or social identity? Or do you find that that's something that's true and genuine to your experiences as a person, as an activist, as a believer?
Well, I mean, I suppose it's unfortunate that something like that was the thing that needed to kind of get people motivated to react or act. And I think, I mean, as an activist, I have to sometimes remind myself that the rest of, if you like, the Muslim community around me is not necessarily perhaps even interested.
Right.
One of the things that I find quite fascinating about the Jewish community and some of the conversations I've had in the last probably 2 or 3 years is almost this open announcement, really, that actually I'm Jewish, but actually secular, and there's very much those kind of things are spoken about very openly, whereas amongst Muslims it's not really. That conversation, I would say, is probably starting now. And it's fascinating because there's no doubt we have a spectrum just as much as any other group does. But I'm not sure that we always openly or confidently acknowledge the spectrum. And I think one of the challenges that we have is recognizing, acknowledging, and actually celebrating our diversity within that spectrum, and acknowledging that people are on different parts of their own life journey, and that it's not one way or the highway, but actually there's a whole lot of different ways of practicing your faith or not.
I think what complicates that often is that nary a week goes by where a headline is about, 1 week it's about halal meat, the next week it's about the Trojan horse in Birmingham, the next week it's about CNI dogs being not allowed in cabs driven by Muslim cab drivers in some northern town. It's very difficult to have space, I mean, political space, social space, when the conversation, I think, Daniel, you pointed out, constantly comes back to this kind of Muslim problem, or the problematic Muslim identity, or those problematic Muslim communities.
And of course the problem then is that you're constantly perhaps perceived of people like us as either reacting or not saying anything. And you almost sometimes can't win, really. If you comment on something, it's almost like, here we go, from within your own communities or from, wider. And it can be quite challenging. And I think it's quite draining as well, because actually, sometimes those of us that are maybe involved in public things sometimes don't really want to be answering all of these things. I don't know what to make of the Trojan horse affair anymore. I don't know what to make of the halal meat issue, because it's kind of, it's not straightforward even. There's a whole lot of different things mixed together that actually, all of which are really very negative. Where's the positive? When are we, where are we allowed to have that sort of positive expression of our faith? And that's where we have to sort of be proactive. Almost that stuff is going to happen anyway. Those of us can almost rise above it or just move along beside it, really, and give that positive and actually express ourselves without it being defined for us.
And then on our own terms, which is what anyone wants. I think any citizen wants is to be defined on their own terms. I'm going to be really cheeky, and I'm going to go to a member of the audience. Nizam, how are you?
Good, thank you.
I hope you can speak nice and loud. So we have some wonderful people here in the audience, and I want to go to my friend Nizamuddin. Nizamuddin works for a charity called Mosaic. Mosaic is part of the family of Princess Charities. That's the Prince of Wales, and Nizam works on projects and programs, and his organization works on projects and programs that run mentoring, particularly for young people within Muslim communities. But the remit is certainly broader than that. And I mean, you've been listening to this conversation, Nizam, over the last sort of 25 minutes. And I'd love to get your sort of feedback to what's been said, but also this question about someone who's born and grew up in the rough East End and has done amazing things as a young activist and a young professional. About to what extent is Britishness malleable and open to cultural difference? And feel free to draw on your own experiences.
Wow. Where do I even begin? I suppose is the first question. As I think the reason why Abdul Rehman has picked me, he knows this is a very pertinent issue in my life, in my own personal journey. Through Mosaic, the organization I work for, it's a mentoring charity primarily. And the things that we find most often are people finding, if we look at faith generally as a identity, what's really interesting with the young people we work with is the fact that they have huge issues reconciling the multiple identities that they wear. This is a journey I went through myself. And part of what I try and do is try and facilitate an environment where these young people can address these issues in a way which is positive, but allows them to own it. And I think the difficulty we have, and this is, I suppose, my contribution, if I may, is you have, if we take myself as the example, I won't put any other examples out there. I grew up, both my parents are immigrants who came over. I grew up in East London, in a very deprived community at a time when schools were horrific. I lacked a certain level of cultural capital, for example, social capital, until I went to university, all the way through which I had a tension, I had pressures on me with regard to faith, with regard to defending my faith, with regard to defending my position in society as a person of color, for example. And I think religion almost didn't come into it for me. And that's what's really interesting. For me, my biggest issues were surviving the breadline, it's about making the money, I suppose. And I suppose the reason why this is important within the Muslim context is the vast majority of Muslims in the UK are from the most deprived areas. And when it comes to Britishness, I suppose the irony is most Muslims have a lot in common with most Brits, because in terms of beyond religion, they're trying to survive at a time which is very difficult. They're trying to get jobs, they're trying to be successful, they're trying to do all of those things. And with the kids we work with, and we work with, for example, some of the schools who have been implicated in this Trojan horse issue, when you go to them and you ask them, how are you doing? What are the key issues that you want to do well in? They care about the same things as everybody else, and actually they don't understand where some of these religious issues come into it. And the irony of all ironies is, because of this pressure, they feel compelled to then wear this religious hat without being informed. And then that leads often to misinformation, misunderstanding of their own faith, which causes problems later on in life. And I almost think if they were left alone and we didn't have the same issues we have at the moment with regard to the scrutiny of faith, I won't have any subjective views on it. You can almost see them moving away from their faith, arguably, if they were left alone. There's so many issues here. I'm not sure exactly which one to touch on, but
that's really helpful. I want to come back to the panel on that, Daniel. In a way, mirroring some of the issues that you sort of touched on earlier, but getting really into the heart of issues around deprivation, histories of migration, but kind of the things that people really care about. How do you respond to Nizam's comments?
Well, I think that the kind of final point there about people, if I understood it rightly, maybe people are drawn to sort of assert their faith more strongly because they feel that it's under attack and then they're defending it. And I think that is something that happens. I think that I know just from sort of friends of mine who come from Muslim backgrounds, there's been, we've tried to sort of give space to this discussion in New Humanist a bit, that people will, we had a writer in the first issue I edited at the end of last year who said, well, they have basically decided they're not religious, but would never kind of openly say, I'm no longer Muslim, because of how they feel that being a Muslim is regarded. This writer grew up in the US and then moved to Britain and grew up in the decade that began with 9/11,
right.
And because of that experience and the way that she was treated when she did wear the hijab, doesn't want to ever completely abandon, that identity.
Because that experience means something to her, and that identity means something to her.
And I think for that reason, really, it's all the more important that what Julie was saying earlier about being able to have a conversation that reflects the entire sort of spectrum within one particular identity, as well as between, you know, cultures that are deemed to be different, is really important. There was something else it made me think of as well, which was when people talk about Britishness and cultural difference and integration and all of these things, almost immediately the emphasis is on the minorities. So the question is always kind of hanging over it. Well, how can this or that minority group become more a part of you know, mainstream society? Or how can they get on better with us? Is the sort of unspoken assumption, I think, quite often when this conversation comes up. But I think this point about the sort of the struggles of many people in Britain being the same, regardless of their cultural background, is really important. And in a way, if you don't acknowledge that, if you don't acknowledge differences in sort of class and socio-economic background and the rest of it, you're never going to kind of reach a sort of, you know, you're never really going to progress in terms of working out ways people can kind of find common ground and the rest of it. And I think, I mean, I'll go back to my work on the far right as an example, because it's what I, you know in detail. But I think, you know, one of the reasons why it's worth keeping an eye on what happens with stuff at the fringes of politics is sometimes it picks up on trends that haven't quite, you know, found any expression elsewhere. And there's a sense in which you can read a surge in votes for UKIP, or even to a certain extent the BNP, as being from communities that themselves were not really feeling part of Britain, which is an odd thing to maybe to sort of propose, because obviously they're draping them, you know, the BNP and the EDL and UKIP, you know, they're the most draped in national symbols of all of the, you know. But really, if you look at the kind of communities where the BNP were able to make inroads, it were communities that, and likewise, I think for UKIP, it's becoming apparent it's a similar thing, that people in these communities are sort of feeling uneasy because they look at the Britain that's in the national media or in national politics and think, this doesn't reflect us. Yet they don't really have another way of expressing that, because there's an assumption that if you're part of the white majority, well, obviously you're British, and therefore there's no conversation to be had.
The white majority is as totalizing a term as Muslim community or Jewish community.
And I just think, I wonder,
yeah,
you know,
go ahead, Julie.
where's the space for people like me or people from different backgrounds to question the
you
things
were
that
part
are
of the white majority,
Yeah,
Julie.
that's right. And I pick and choose. You know, I pick and choose wherever I can benefit from the most. Now, I just wonder sometimes, where's the space for us to question the things that you know, there's lots of things in this country that I don't like, or that I feel are supposed to be British. I feel very uncomfortable with, or very unhappy about the way things are going. And where's that space for people to be able to have that conversation and almost criticise? Because I see it as my country, and so we're all in it together. So some of the things I see happening around young people, you know, the headline on the front of I think it's the Evening Standard today, is about gangs in London, and the horrific statistics are just beyond belief that that kind of stuff is happening. Are we really having that kind of, you know, and how do I feel about alcohol, for example, and the impact that has on our country? And can I have that open, can I say that or not? Or is that somehow, because you're different or a Muslim or this or that? You know, and actually, no, it's not. It's because I want to just have that conversation with everybody to think what we can do. There's lots of things that are not good about this country, or the people, or the way we do things. There's lots of amazing things about it, but I'm just not sure that we can always feel comfortable always having those conversations in the way that I think I'd quite like to.
Do the communities you talk to and you work with, Dave, do they feel comfortable having those kinds of conversations? And I think picking up on something that Nizam said, which is interesting, is that the whole question of class and social and economic realities and their impact on the way we feel like we belong and the way we belong, I think is a fascinating idea and concept.
I think that point, the point of class and the point of economic attainment is the crucial point when it comes to integration, when it comes to feeling of powerlessness amongst communities. If you go back to the pre-war years, you have Jewish communities living in exactly the same part of London. Also, with very similar problems of housing, of poverty, and you had political radicalism, which at the time was communism. And you had this great aspirational movement of Jews out of the East End after the war into where most Jews in London now live in northwest London, and this was part of an economic aspiration. And when people look at the Jewish community today and see effectively a white, relatively affluent, relatively integrated community, this has happened in the course of a couple of generations, really. But you go back really within living memory and the same problems were all there. And I think that journey is precisely the journey from social and economic exclusion and powerlessness towards integration. And it's a journey that can be tracked along lots of different measures, and along with it came not necessarily secularization, because a lot of the community was quite secularized already, but I suppose an adaptation to British mores, British social ways. And this is, you now have much more recently arrived minority communities, and there's a great pressure put on these communities and people within these communities to follow the same journey, and a lot of kind of finger pointing. Why aren't you the same? Why haven't you done the same thing? And I do think that pressure is counterproductive. I definitely think that the more you hammer away at people who already feel excluded and powerless, the less likely you are to open up a space for that kind of integration to happen.
There's two or three really interesting points that I want to pick up. But Daniel, say what you were going to say. I'm going to get an intervention from Nizam, but then I'm going to ask for the mic to come over here, and I'm going to hear one or two other voices here. Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, well, it was just picking up on that point Dave was making, made me think of how strongly I disagreed with the comments of the former chief rabbi when he stepped down, who made a speech about multiculturalism, and it had this kind of, I don't know if he overtly directed it at Muslims in Britain, but he said something along the lines of, learn from the Jews, we've kept our heads down, that's why we've got on so well, and we've just, we've integrated well. And I just thought that sort of undersold the whole sort of, couple of centuries story there. Very much.
There is a mythology about the supposed ease of Jewish integration into this country, and it is a mythology that I think flattens and ignores the extent to which Jews in the 19th century had to adapt and change in order to fit in and be accepted. It ignores the social and political upheavals in the East End of London in the 1930s and over the final years of the British mandate in Palestine, immediately post-war, and the impact that had in this country. And, now, okay, it's great, all Jews are integrated, it's wonderful, and it's in everyone's interest to kind of sweep that history under the carpet, except that history is both interesting in its own right and also, I think, instructive for us now and for the future.
There's a whole really interesting question about political identity and how we behave as political animals and beings within the public square. I want to come to that before we finish. Nizam, you have 30 seconds, real quick.
Very quick. I think a lot of my questions and thoughts are very much based around socioeconomic status. And the question I have is, in terms of segmentation of what Britishness means, we're in a phenomenal venue here, the Royal Opera House. And I think to myself, when we're an aspirational society, when people from different communities, different faiths aspire, the one unique thing about Britain compared to our neighbours across the pond is this class structure, which very much exists to this day. And what I'd like to ask the panelists is the notion of aspiration and attainment, and whether there are certain ivory towers in terms of attainment where, because of where they grew up and the environments they grew up in, lack of opportunity, lack of networks, the social cultural capital that you otherwise might get, does that then impact on how British they feel? And do you think there is a almost tiered or tiers of Britishness? And I think I'll leave it at that.
That's an excellent question. I'm going to park it for a second. Keep it in your mind. I just want to come over here. We have two academics with us tonight, both from North America, one from Canada, one from the United States. And I want to turn to them for a second because they both lived here for a time, but their research is around looking at Muslim communities and looking at young people and identity. So I'm going to go to Nabila first. Nabila Munawar is a PhD student at the London School of Economics in the Department of Sociology, and her work is looking at formations of Muslim identity in Canada in a post 9/11 reality, and it's ethnographic research. So it means that you spoke to young people in the places that they exist, and you've lived in the UK for a number of years, and I'd love for you to maybe contrast a little bit on your experiences here in the United Kingdom with some of your findings as a researcher. And I mean, feel free to sort of highlight anything that you think might be relevant, because it's a unique perspective, and I think that transatlantic perspective, as Nizam said, is often very high on our collective agenda. We're always looking at our fellow English speakers across the pond for some point of reference. Go ahead.
Well, my research in Canada was about what does it mean to be a Muslim young person in Canada and Muslimness in general. But I guess the findings, I'm still working through it now, is more about other issues to do with immigration, issues to do with jobs, money, family, all those kind of things. And I haven't done research like that in the UK. But I remember when I was reading a lot of the stuff around the riots, I found a lot of similarities between the kind of things that young people were saying at that time with my findings.
These are the London riots of 2 years ago.
London riots. And this kind of sense of like a disenchantment with their communities and, you know, this idea of, like, you know, like some of the young people that I talked to and I asked them, do you feel very Canadian? It was just kind of like a strange question, like, why does it even matter? And it's just completely disassociated with it. And I remember hearing some of that as well. There's this kind of Britishness being kind of besides the point, because it's not a part of their everyday lives. And, you know, these things come up when you're dealing with the police and whatnot. Like, there are certain kind of moments of encounter and places of encounter where they come to the fore. But in terms of like their kind of everyday, day-to-day lives, I mean, it's just what a lot of young people go through.
So anyway, would you agree with sort of the picture that Nizam has painted, that young people are far more concerned about other things, and to a certain extent their sense of nationality or even their sense of faith sort of ties into specific moments of their lives, but may not always be at the fore?
Yeah, it may not always be at the fore, but I think there are some sticking points. You know, an example is, you know, one of the young people that I interviewed, you know, he said, oh, I'm not a practicing Muslim, and, you know, I don't believe in God, and, you know, I call myself Muslim because that's my identity, that's where my family, you know, is Muslim. But when the whole incident happened with that film about the Prophet Muhammad, I forget the name of the guy that did it. When it was playing in the youth club, he just couldn't take it, and he just said, no, that's too much. And when I pressed him on it later on, I just said, you know, but I thought you don't really believe in any of that stuff. And he's like, no, that's too far. And that's what I mean. There's these certain kind of sticking points, like I'll go this far. And I might make the joke myself about looking like a terrorist or like, you know, something about my family or whatever. But, you know, there's a point where it is too far. And, yeah, and I think events that happen kind of bring those things about.
There's a far more complex relationship then. Things like faith. I mean, this idea of faith identity, and I think in many ways echoes what you were saying, Dave. It's actually quite deep, and there's different levels of engagement with that. And there, even for the irreligious Jewish person or Muslim person or Christian person, there may be a point where you're kind of like, no, we can't go. There's a certain line that's very difficult to cross.
And this idea that you can have a faith identity that is entirely secular and you don't believe in God may on paper seem a contradiction, but it's not for the millions of people who have that identity. That's their lived experience. But I think for a lot of people who, in the position you're describing, you can go through your normal daily life doing your normal daily things, and something like that will happen, and a certain part of your identity will be the thing that you feel in that process because of that trigger.
I know the clock is slowly running out on us, but I don't want to miss a remark from Dr. Arshad Ali. Arshad is soon to take up a professorship at George Washington University in the Department of Education there, and he's been in London for the last 2 years as a John Adams Fellow at the Institute of Education in the Center for Muslim Education, and his work has been around young Muslims in post 9/11 security scenarios in California and on the East Coast in New York. And I know, Arshad, you've spent a lot of time looking at issues around identity and identity formation, not from the top down, but from the ground up. But I'm particularly fascinated by your critical analysis of the comparison points here in the United Kingdom. I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about that and things that kind of bother you about the discourse here. And as an academic who's now transatlantic, I'd love for you to maybe pick up one or two of those things just to throw them into the mix, even if we can't address them properly, because I think they're important.
Sure. These will probably be kind of disjointed thoughts.
That's fine.
But I mean, I think when we talk about this idea of Muslimness, for example, or Asianness, or any other sort of identity, project of identity, we have to remember these aren't somehow inherent identities, but these are assemblages that come together in particular times, particular moments. Like the idea of Asianness as an identity only is relevant in the context of when we talk about it in Britain. If you're in South Asia, if you're in India, you don't talk about yourself as an Asian. If you're in Bangladesh, you don't call yourself an Asian. You only call yourself an Asian in the context of being in Britain, or in the context of, in the US, you talk about yourself as a South Asian, maybe. So we have to remember these ideas, these identities are not inherent, but rather they come together in particular moments, oftentimes particularly in politically salient moments. So the idea of Muslimness.
Directly or indirectly.
Jewish Museum.
The Brussels.
Right.
I'm saying it's very similar to what happened in Toulouse. So.
Did you see the CCTV? I mean, talk about just so brazen and just terrible. It's horrible. I can show those waters or.
Or the idea of Jewishness as a sort of unified singular identity comes together because of a particular political context, not just out of thin air, not just because people have a certain affinity to one another. So I think when we talk about the Rushdie affair in Britain, this becomes a particular salient point where Muslimness is an assemblage around Asianness, around difference. When we talk about kind of incorporation, I think the question of Jewishness in England as well as Jewishness in the US becomes an interesting one. And I'm not as familiar with British history, but when we think about Jewishness alongside Germanness or Irishness in the US, we talk about those communities being incorporated over time into some relationship with whiteness. I think we have to remember that those are all communities that were able to assimilate into whiteness. And there's going to be a fundamental difference with communities that are from that can't pass as white, and those are going to be real differences in these histories. In the North American context, you've seen African American communities, you see Native American communities, communities from south of the U.S., from Latin America, from Mexico, that haven't been assimilated into the American project. And is that simply because there's an inherent difference between those bodies and Irish bodies that came much later?
Fascinating.
And I think kind of the last point I'll kind of throw out is this question of what are really our goals when we talk about integration? What do we want? What are our aspirations for a community? Are they simply to participate in the society the way it is, or is it to help create society to look different? Often we have this discussion in North America about representation, right? And we want communities of color equally represented equally represented in structures of inequality? Is that our goal? Is it simply to have inequality distributed across racial, ethnic, religious lines, or is it to change the structures of inequality in society?
Arjun, I'm going to pick that last point up because I think that ties nicely into, really I think in terms of time, probably the final thing we'll have a chance to discuss is this relationship of identity and a political project. And I mean, for me, as someone who became, I married someone who was born in the United Kingdom, but spent most of her life outside of the United Kingdom, returned back, had a passport, so she was as British as the next person. I married her a few years later because of spousal sponsorship. I now hold a Canadian passport and a British passport. My son's born in London. He's British, but we're from a Punjabi, Bangladeshi, Canadian, Singaporean mélange. And here we are in the East London, living next to neighbors who Jewish neighbors who are in their 90s and who were born literally on the footprint that our block was built on in 1951 because their homes were bombed by the Nazis. You know, this is the reality of Britishness today. It's an ongoing project. The fact that Great Britain is four nations at the very least that come together. Englishness and Anglo-Saxon is a mongrel race, as Billy Bragg and others like to point out. So the whole notion of Britishness seems like something that's so fluid and in flux. When did it become singular, and why has it become singular, and why perhaps are we not addressing this question of can we envision a Britishness or an Englishness that is transformative and that's politically progressive? Lots of issues. Feel free to pick any one of them up. I'm going to go to Daniel first.
Okay, well, this maybe introduces another huge topic.
Sure.
That is too much for this evening's discussion. But
let's throw it out there.
I mean,
it'll be percolating in our minds.
I was thinking about this in preparation for the talk because quite often in these discussions the word community becomes very prominent, and I wonder if there, you know, and people assume that the problem with too much diversity is we lose this sense of community, and that's something that needs to be restored. And actually, I mean, I think what's happened here and in other countries in Europe in the last few decades is it's not community that's been under attack, but the idea of society. And that, you know, we've had 50, 60 years of a kind of consensus of social democracy that, you know, the state is there to provide these social goods and that you have a right to them by being a citizen, and that this has been slowly eroded. And governments, in order to sort of pursue that project, have had to come up with something to replace it. So the idea of Britishness has become more important because, you know, the way that politicians talk about Britishness is increasingly become about values, and it's about who is owed these, you know, social goods are no longer a right, but you know, it's something you get in return for.
It's something privileged, isn't it?
Yeah, that you know, the NHS or a safety net when you're out of work is something that is given to people because you know, they're part of Britishness, not because it's you know, this idea of these things being universal, it is being eroded. And I think the more that happens, the more to the forefront of the conversation comes this idea of, well, we have to share these values in order to kind of work as a community, and then this word community sort of crops up more and more.
Julie, is Britishness a work in progress? And if it is, then isn't our contribution more vital than ever before? And our voices and the voice of diversity more vital than ever before?
Yeah, I mean, I really do feel it's part of the journey, and it's very exciting. It can be challenging, but I think more it's exciting. I think if we don't provide spaces, particularly for young people, picking up on some of the points that have already been made, from whatever background, then it's going to be more challenging than it needs to be, because you need to be able to give people a space. I remember doing an event recently where I was asked to speak. I was asked to speak about British Islam, you know, and what that is, and you know, not realising that the person who was given the speech before me totally destroyed the idea that anything like that could even exist.
Right.
That was handy. But what you ended up with was what was picked up on just now, was that there were young people in the audience that were looking at each other when she was talking and thinking to themselves, what are you talking about?
It doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense, because I am what I am. And why do you all need to keep on talking about it or talking at me? I am British and it's not an issue, let's just move on. I don't even want to talk about it. You know, we have a 16-year-old in our house now. And believe me, you know, when you talk about the different mixtures of challenges and questions, and it's fascinating for me, challenging as a parent, but fascinating at the pushback or the questioning that she does for us. If we don't give that space, we end up with problems because, as we've already heard, young people want to exploit, but in their own way, in a space that they feel safe in, not judged or particularly put into a box. And that I do see happening. But otherwise, as an experiment and as a journey, I think it's got to be seen as a good thing.
Dave, this may be our last comment. I'm looking at our timekeeper in terms of, and if we can't have some more concluding remarks, we will. But we may end with you on this. And some fascinating ideas about the project of Britishness. And how do you feel about that? And given the work that you do, which is quite, you know, being involved in the community as you are in terms of feeling that you're doing work that protects the interests of your community and offers safety and security to your community. Is Britishness a project that is ongoing, that's a work in progress? Or?
What I find fascinating is that here we are talking about newly arrived or recently arrived communities wanting to join Britishness and wanting to be allowed to join Britishness. And yet we have some of the oldest parts of Britishness on the Celtic fringes spinning away. You know, Scotland might leave Britishness altogether this year. So it's definitely a fluid process. I think this question of what is integration for is the crucial question. And when you asked that, I came back to what Julie said earlier of, as an individual, wanting to feel the right to voice criticisms, questions, and through that expressing an element of possession of Britishness, that you want to feel you have part ownership of it. And I think in all the talk of communities, it's very important not to lose sight of the importance of individuals and the need to allow space for individuals to assert the way they live their lives and the way they live their identities, and not just say, well, okay, integration is about lining up all these different communities next to each other. It's about also individuals.
And allowing individuals to assert solidarities when they want to and on their own terms.
And in whichever direction they feel.
Exactly. And I think that part of the challenge is that there's essentially a democratic challenge here, which is that if I'm a Muslim and I feel like it's important that my Britishness and my Muslimness engage and I need to organize on that basis, then I should be able to do so. And for those who don't want to, they shouldn't be forced into it. But I think the broader issues around the values that I'm concerned about are inequality, injustice, access, the things that Daniel was talking about and Arshad mentioned as well. I think those are far more powerful ideas that I think for us are incredibly challenging, whichever side of the faith or cultural difference spectrum we come from. I think Schoenberg would be very proud of our discussion tonight. And I hope we all have a chance to see Moses and Aron. Maybe we can all go together and go for dinner afterwards to talk about it. I'm certainly looking forward to it. How are we for time? Are we good? I really want to thank each and every one of you, Daniel, David, and Julie. A big round of applause from our lovely audience. And I want to thank those of you who are troopers tonight and came out here to the Royal Opera House. And special thanks to Roxana Fayaz, the Chief Executive at the Maimonides Interfaith Foundation, for inviting us all to the Welsh National Opera, Siobhan and Alison for allowing us to be here, for the Royal Opera House and their wonderful team for hosting us tonight. And I really enjoyed that, and it was good to get to know all of you and all of you. And I hope you let your friends know about this, tweet about it, because it'll be online tomorrow, and people can watch it and engage with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.